My husband threw a glass at my face and it changed my whole life for the better. Now he's back to ruin it. My husband Jackson has been an alcoholic for years, and today he'd been drinking since noon. His boss had sent him home early for being hungover, and somehow that was my fault. When he came home, the first thing he did was hurl his pint glass at me. No greeting, no hug or kiss, just glass shattering against my cheekbone and blood running down my face. I ran to the kitchen and pressed a dish towel to my face, all while he screamed that no one would ever want me now that I was damaged goods. The ER doctor said the cut would leave a permanent scar running from my left temple to the corner of my mouth and asked if I wanted to file a police report. I'd covered for Jackson for years, but knowing that my face was ruined was the last straw. I'd always wanted to be a model, even though Jackson has forbidden it. Now that dream was dead, and I was done. I said yes. I wanted to file a report, while Jackson's mother called me 46 times to say I was overreacting and ruining her son's future over a little accident. 6 weeks later, I was living in a women's shelter with a restraining order and a face that made strangers stare, then quickly look away. The scar had healed into a curved line that looked like a crescent moon had been carved into my skin. I wore hoodies with the hood up even in summer, and avoided mirrors because Jackson's voice saying "damaged goods" played on repeat in my head. But slowly I started going to the support group meetings where other women had their own scars, both visible and hidden. The counselor kept telling us we were survivors, not victims, but I still flinched whenever someone looked at my face too long. Then a photographer approached me at a coffee shop saying my face was the most interesting thing she'd photographed in years. She said the scar made me look like a warrior goddess, and asked if I'd model for her portfolio about resilience and beauty. I thought she was mocking me until she showed me the test shots on her camera, where somehow the scar caught the light and made me look powerful instead of broken. Within a month, those photos went viral on Instagram with millions of women sharing them and calling me brave and beautiful. A modeling agency called saying they wanted to sign me specifically because my scar told a story that resonated with people tired of perfect faces. My first campaign was for a major makeup brand with the tagline, "Beauty isn't perfect," and my scarred face was on billboards in Times Square. Every interview asked about the scar, and I told the truth about Jackson, and suddenly I was getting invited to speak at conferences about domestic violence. The modeling money let me start a foundation for women escaping abuse. I was on magazine covers, and women would stop me crying, saying my story gave them courage to leave their own abusers. Jackson lost everything once my story went public, and his company fired him for reputational damage. His mother called begging me to stop ruining his life, but I wasn't doing anything except telling the truth when asked. Sophie, my assistant, forwarded me screenshots showing he was living in his car after being evicted and getting rejected from every job once they Googled his name. His new girlfriend had left him when she found out what he did, and his friends disappeared once the news articles started circulating. He'd gone from a successful marketing executive to unemployable pariah in less than a year, while I was getting paid 6 figures to be the face of survivor campaigns. I was preparing for my TED Talk about reclaiming your narrative after trauma when my lawyer called saying Jackson was suing me for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. He claimed I'd deliberately destroyed his life by lying about the incident, and was seeking $10 million in damages plus a gag order preventing me from ever mentioning him again. He says he has proof that you injured yourself to frame him, my lawyer said, reading from the filing. He's also claiming the scar was self-inflicted for attention, and that you've built your entire career on destroying an innocent man. I felt my hands start shaking as she continued reading his allegations that I'd planned everything to become famous. The worst part is he's representing himself, but he's got a team of men's rights activists funding his case, and they're already spinning this online as a false accusation that ruined a good man's life. She paused before delivering the final blow that made my blood turn to ice. He's demanding a jury trial and says he has witnesses who will testify that you were unstable and violent throughout your marriage. I stared at my scar in the mirror, knowing every word he said was a lie, but also knowing that Jackson had always been able to make people believe whatever version of reality he created. My fingers traced the scar one more time before I closed my eyes and took 3 deep breaths. I grabbed my phone and called Sophie, my voice staying steady even though my hands were shaking. So bad I could barely hold the phone. "Cancel everything for the next week," I told her. "We need an emergency meeting with the legal team tomorrow morning." Sophie didn't ask questions, just said she'd handle it and started listing the appointments she'd move. That night I couldn't sleep at all. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and started digging through old emails from 2 years ago. Every photo from the ER visit was still in my sent folder from when I'd emailed them to myself for backup. The close-up of my face with blood running down showed the glass pieces still stuck in my skin. I found the medical records showing the exact depth and angle of the cuts. The police report had Jackson's blood alcohol level at 0.21 when they arrested him. I organized everything into folders on my laptop, creating a timeline with dates and evidence for each incident. My eyes burned from staring at the screen, but I kept going, finding text messages where Jackson threatened me, voicemails where he screamed that I was worthless. By dawn, I had 47 folders of proof that every word I'd ever said about him was true. The next morning, I met with my lawyer at her office downtown, and she'd already brought in someone new. Melanie Groves walked in wearing a navy suit and carrying 3 boxes of files. "I specialize in defamation defense for domestic violence survivors," she said, shaking my hand firmly. She spread out my evidence on the conference table and studied each piece carefully. "You have a strong defense, But this will get ugly fast, she said after reviewing everything. Men's rights groups pick cases like this to make examples of women who speak out. She explained their strategy of drowning us in legal costs and public harassment until we gave up. 2 days later, Sophie's phone started ringing nonstop. 3 major brands called saying they were reassessing their contracts with me pending the lawsuit outcome. The foundation's biggest donor wanted an urgent meeting about potential reputational risks to their company. Sophie tried to reassure them, but I could hear the doubt in their voices through the speaker. By the end of the first week, my social media was completely flooded. Hundreds of messages from men's rights activists called me a liar and a fraud. The death threats started showing up in my DMs with specific details about where I lived and worked. One message described exactly what route I took to the gym every morning. Another had photos of my apartment building. Melanie looked at the screenshots and immediately said we needed to file police reports. These aren't just angry comments anymore, she said. This is targeted harassment meant to scare you into dropping your defense. Crystal Montgomery showed up at my apartment the next day with a clipboard and a serious expression. She walked through every room checking windows and noting entry points. You need new locks immediately, she said, testing my doorframe. These are standard apartment locks that anyone could pick in 30 seconds. She recommended security cameras for my hallway and varying my daily routes. Never take the same path twice in a row, she said. Park in different spots, use different exits, change your schedule randomly. It felt exactly like being back in the women's shelter, planning every movement around staying safe from Jackson. Melanie filed our initial response to the lawsuit within the week. The document denied all of Jackson's allegations and asserted truth as our absolute defense. She also filed a motion to dismiss his most ridiculous claims as legally baseless. He's claiming you planned this for years, but you have medical records showing immediate injury, she said. No judge will take that seriously. But Jackson's team kept pushing forward with their media campaign online. I started seeing Adriana Fowler 3 times a week to prepare for what was coming. She specialized in helping survivors get through legal proceedings without falling apart. We practiced breathing exercises for when they would question me about that night. They'll try to make you angry or emotional, she said during our first session. Your job is to stay calm and stick to facts. We role-played scenarios where Jackson's lawyer would blame me for provoking him. Each session left me exhausted, but I was getting stronger at not reacting to the triggers. Jenny Acosta called an emergency foundation board meeting that Friday. Several members sat around the conference table looking worried about the lawsuit's impact on fundraising. 2 major donors have already pulled out, Jenny said, reading from her notes. 3 more are waiting to see what happens with the case. I stood up and looked at each board member. If we back down now, we betray every woman who sees our foundation as proof that survivors can fight back, I said. Jackson wants to silence me and destroy everything we've built for these women. Some board members nodded, but others still looked concerned about the financial impact. The following Monday, Jackson's legal team filed a motion for a gag order. They claimed my continued speaking engagements were prejudicing potential jurors against their client. The thought of being silenced again made my stomach turn and my hands shake. I'd spent 2 years finding my voice after Jackson tried to destroy it, and now he wanted the court to take it away. Melanie said we'd fight the motion, but warned me that judges sometimes granted partial gag orders in high-profile cases. We need to be strategic about what you say publicly from now on, she told me. Sophie knocked on my office door the next morning holding her phone with a worried look on her face. A reporter from some gossip site had called asking for our comment about new developments in Jackson's case, but wouldn't say what those developments were. Sophie and I decided not to say anything until we knew what Jackson's team was planning next. 3 days later, the court papers arrived and my stomach dropped when I saw the timeline. Judge Charles Osborne had scheduled our first hearing for just 3 weeks away and set an aggressive discovery schedule that meant Jackson's lawyers could dig through every part of my life looking for dirt. Melanie called me immediately after getting the same papers and warned me this judge liked to move cases fast, which meant we'd have less time to prepare than we hoped. I spent that afternoon on the phone with the TED Talk organizers explaining why I had to withdraw from their event next month. They were understanding, but I could hear the disappointment in the coordinator's voice when she said they'd been promoting my talk for months already. Another piece of my voice being taken away by Jackson's lawsuit. The next morning, Sophie showed me her laptop screen, and I felt sick looking at my own medical records from the ER visit posted on some trashy gossip blog. Someone had edited the records to make it look like I had old scars from self-harm, even though the original records showed nothing like that. Melanie filed an emergency motion about evidence tampering within the hour and demanded the blog take down the fake documents. Crystal called me that afternoon saying she'd noticed the same dark sedan parked outside my building for 3 straight days. She ran the plates through her contacts and confirmed it was registered to a private investigation firm that Jackson's team had hired to watch me. Now I couldn't even leave my apartment without wondering who was following me and what they were looking for. 2 days later, my biggest makeup sponsor called asking if we could soften my campaign message to avoid controversy during the lawsuit. The marketing director suggested we focus on general empowerment instead of survivor stories until the legal situation was resolved. I told them no, because that was exactly what Jackson wanted, and I wouldn't let him control my message even through corporate pressure. I could hear the hesitation in her voice when she said they'd discuss it with their board and get back to me. That weekend, Sophie forwarded me a link she said I shouldn't read, but I clicked it anyway. Some supposedly neutral website had published an article examining both sides of our story and giving equal weight to Jackson's lies and my documented truth. The article treated his claims about me faking my injury as seriously as the police reports and medical records proving what really happened. The comment section was full of people arguing, and Sophie begged me not to read them, but I couldn't stop scrolling through the hate. Monday brought an email from a journalist named Kathy Sumner, who said she'd been investigating the funding behind Jackson's legal team. She'd traced the money to a larger network that was systematically targeting prominent women who spoke out about abuse. Kathy wanted to interview me for her investigation, but when I called Melanie, she advised against talking to any journalists until after the hearing. The discovery requests arrived by courier that Tuesday, and my hands shook as I read through the list of people they wanted to depose. They demanded depositions from the photographer who discovered me and launched my career with those first photos. They wanted to question the counselor from the women's shelter who'd helped me rebuild my confidence after leaving Jackson. They even wanted to depose Sophie, who'd only been working for me for 6 months and had nothing to do with my marriage. Reading through the list felt almost as violating as that night Jackson threw the glass at my face. Every person who'd helped me heal was now being dragged into his attempt to destroy me again. Adriana scheduled extra sessions with me that week to prepare for what was coming. She taught me breathing exercises to stay calm when Jackson's lawyer would try to twist my words during depositions. We spent hours role-playing scenarios where they'd blame me for provoking Jackson or claim I'd planned everything for attention. She'd pretend to be Jackson's lawyer, asking horrible questions about why I stayed with him if he was really abusive. Each session left me exhausted, but I was getting better at not reacting when she pushed my buttons. Adriana reminded me that staying calm and sticking to facts would be my best defense against their tactics. The private investigator's car moved to different spots around my building, but Crystal spotted it every time. She started varying my routes and having me use different exits to make it harder for them to track my movements. Living like this brought back memories of those first weeks in the shelter when I was scared Jackson would find me. Now he'd found a different way to make me feel hunted, even with a restraining order keeping him physically away. Sophie fielded calls from more reporters every day, and we stopped answering unknown numbers completely. My inbox filled with interview requests and hate mail in equal measure, while my social media mentions became a war zone I couldn't look at anymore. The foundation's donation page got flooded with fake $1 donations using horrible messages in the name fields that Sophie had to manually delete. Everything I'd built over 2 years was attacked from every direction, and Jackson hadn't even stepped into a courtroom yet. The forensic tech Melanie hired spent 3 days going through my social media and found texts from 2 years ago where I'd apologized to Jackson after fights. She printed them out and spread them across the conference table, each one looking worse without the context of what came before. Melanie said we needed to pull the full conversation threads from my old phone backup to show how he'd twist everything until I was apologizing for things he'd done. Sophie helped me dig through cloud storage for hours until we found the complete messages showing Jackson calling me names, then demanding apologies when I cried. We organized everything into folders with timestamps and notes about what had really happened each time. Jenny Acosta asked to meet me privately at a coffee shop near the foundation office the next morning. She looked nervous and kept checking her phone while telling me 2 of our biggest donors were getting cold feet. They'd each given over $100,000 last year, but now their boards were worried about bad press. Jenny said they might pull funding completely if the lawsuit kept making headlines, which would mean cutting the emergency housing program. The foundation helped 40 women leave their abusers last month, and without that money, we'd have to turn people away. I spent the rest of that week with the foundation's legal team creating a new structure to protect the organization. We set up a separate board that could run things without me if needed, though the thought of stepping back from my own foundation made me sick. The lawyers drafted papers that legally separated my personal brand from the foundation's operations. It took 3 days of meetings and paperwork, but we got everything filed before the gag order hearing. Sophie rescheduled all my speaking engagements while we waited to see what the judge would allow. The courthouse was packed with reporters when Crystal drove me to the hearing 2 weeks later. Judge Osborne looked tired as he read through both sides' arguments about what I could and couldn't say publicly. Jackson's lawyer argued that any mention of domestic violence would prejudice potential jurors against his client. Melanie countered that silencing me would violate my First Amendment rights and harm the women who needed to hear my story. After an hour of arguments, Judge Osborne ruled I could continue my advocacy work, but couldn't mention Jackson by name or discuss specifics of the pending case. The partial victory felt like a loss, since every speech I gave started with my story of that night. Sophie had to rewrite all my talking points to be vague about my experience, without saying who hurt me. Jackson's mother went on 3 different podcasts that week, claiming I was a gold digger who'd ruined her son's life. Jessie Conley, the investigator Melanie hired, found payment records showing the men's rights group paid her $5,000 per appearance. She told the same lies on each show about how I'd seduced Jackson, destroyed his career, and was now profiting from his downfall. The podcast host never challenged her story or asked for proof of anything she claimed. Jessie also started tracking the death threats that flooded my inbox and social media every day. Most were random trolls, but the worst ones included my home address and daily schedule, which meant someone was watching me. He traced the IP addresses to a local chapter of Jackson's supporter network that met at a bar downtown every Thursday. The police took the report, but said they were overwhelmed with similar cases and couldn't promise much. Crystal started varying my routes even more, and had me use 3 different cars to throw off anyone following me. Then Melanie got a call that changed everything about our case. Cole Erickson had lived in the apartment next to ours for 2 years and heard everything through the thin walls that night. He'd been traveling for work when the police first investigated, but saw a news story about the lawsuit and reached out. Cole remembered the exact words because Jackson had screamed them, so loud that Cole's girlfriend asked if they should call the police. He was willing to testify, but worried about what Jackson's supporters might do to him. Melanie met with Cole 3 times that week to prepare his statement while Crystal arranged security for him. Cole signed a sworn affidavit describing the sound of glass breaking at exactly 9:15 that night, followed by Jackson screaming "damaged goods" over and over. He'd even texted his girlfriend about it that night, which gave us time-stamped proof that matched my police report perfectly. Reading Cole's statement made me cry because finally someone else was confirming what really happened. Jackson's legal team filed a motion within hours claiming Cole was lying for money or fame. They demanded access to all his financial records to prove we'd paid him off, even though Cole had refused any compensation for coming forward. They also threatened to sue him for defamation if he testified, trying to scare him into backing down. Cole told Melanie he wouldn't be bullied and would testify no matter what they threatened. While all this was happening, Sophie was quietly negotiating with the brands that hadn't completely abandoned me. 3 companies that had paused their contracts decided to renew after their legal teams reviewed all the evidence we'd gathered. Sophie added protective clauses saying they could cancel without penalty if the jury ruled against me, but at least some income was coming back. The renewed contracts weren't worth as much as before, but they'd keep me afloat during the legal battle. The next morning, Melanie called with bad news about the ER doctor who'd treated my face that night. He'd gotten 3 separate complaints filed against his medical license in the past week, and now he was scared to testify. I could hear papers shuffling through the phone while Melanie explained how Jackson's lawyers had been calling his practice daily with threats about malpractice suits. The doctor still had all the records and photos from that night, but he wanted to stay neutral instead of coming to court. Melanie said she'd handle it, but I could tell from her voice that losing him as a witness would hurt our case. 2 days later, we sat in Judge Osborne's courtroom while he ordered both sides to turn over our phones for forensic review to check if any text messages had been altered or deleted. I handed mine over right away while Tyson Steele stood up filing objection after objection about privacy and attorney-client privilege. The judge wasn't having it and gave them 72 hours to comply or face sanctions. That same week, Sophie forwarded me an email that made my stomach drop, because someone had created fake invoices showing our foundation supposedly spent donation money on luxury items and personal expenses. The invoices looked real with our logo and everything, but the purchases were completely made up. Sophie said they'd been sent to every single donor on our mailing list, with an anonymous note claiming I was using the foundation as my personal bank account. Our accountant had to drop everything and start pulling real receipts and bank statements to prove the invoices were fake. I spent the next 2 days locked in the foundation office with our financial team going through every single transaction from the past year. We created detailed transparency reports showing exactly where every dollar went, with receipts for rent assistance, legal aid, counseling services, and emergency shelter costs for the women we helped. My eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets, but we managed to publish everything online before Jackson's team could spread more lies. The photographer who discovered me had her deposition scheduled for the following Monday, and I watched through a video link as she sat across from Tyson Steele answering his questions. She explained how she'd approached me at the coffee shop because the scar made my face interesting, and how the photos were about showing strength, not attacking anyone. Tyson kept trying to make her admit she'd exploited my trauma for profit, but she stayed calm and just repeated the truth about wanting to show beauty in survival. 3 weeks into the legal battle, I got home to find Crystal holding an envelope that had been delivered by courier. My hands shook as I read Jackson's handwriting saying he forgave me for destroying his life and hoped I could find peace with myself. The letter came through his lawyer, so technically it didn't violate the restraining order directly, but the psychological effect was exactly what he wanted. Melanie filed for sanctions immediately, but Judge Osborne only fined Jackson's team $2,000 for the violation without dismissing the case. The fine felt like nothing compared to the panic attacks I'd been having since reading his words about forgiving me, like I was the one who'd done something wrong. Then finally, some good news came when Ricardo Guerra called Melanie saying he wanted to testify about Jackson's drinking at work. Ricardo had been Jackson's co-worker for 5 years, and remembered multiple times Jackson came to work drunk or hungover. He even had emails where Jackson bragged about keeping me in line and making sure I knew my place. Ricardo was nervous about getting involved, but said he couldn't stay quiet knowing Jackson was trying to flip the story. The next afternoon, I sat in Adriana's office shaking with rage about having to prove over and over that I was telling the truth. She had me do breathing exercises and write down all my anger in a journal that we burned in her fireplace. We spent 2 hours working on ways to channel my fury into determination, instead of letting it eat me alive. Adriana reminded me that my truth didn't need Jackson's validation, and that staying focused on helping other women was more important than his lies. By the end of our session, I felt steadier, even though the anger was still there under the surface. The following week, Melanie called with news that made everything else fade away, because Jackson's team had made a settlement offer. They would drop the lawsuit completely if I signed an NDA agreeing never to mention Jackson or the glass incident in any public forum ever again. The offer also required removing all references to domestic violence from my speaking engagements and basically erasing the foundation's origin story. Melanie said the offer was good for 72 hours and that some of her colleagues thought I should consider it just to make this nightmare end. I stared at the settlement papers thinking about all the women who'd told me my story gave them courage to leave. Signing would mean betraying every single one of them and proving Jackson right that money could buy silence. The smart move would be taking the deal and moving on with my life. But I knew I'd never forgive myself for choosing the easy way out when so many women were counting on me to keep speaking. I told Melanie to reject the offer and prepare for trial because some things were worth more than peace. The foundation board called an emergency meeting 2 days later, where Jenny Acosta and 3 other members sat around the conference table looking worried while I explained why taking the settlement would destroy everything we stood for. Jenny kept tapping her pen against her notepad, while the treasurer pulled up donation reports showing a 30% drop since the lawsuit started. I reminded them that our whole mission was helping women escape abuse and find their voices, not teaching them to accept money for silence. The room got quiet until Jenny surprised everyone by standing up and saying she agreed with me because her own sister had been silenced with an NDA 20 years ago and still regretted it. The vote came down 4-3 in favor of rejecting the settlement, with Jenny casting the deciding vote. That night, I sat at my computer for 6 hours writing a new speech about surviving trauma that never once mentioned Jackson's name, but still told my truth through broader themes about healing and resilience. I practiced it in front of my bathroom mirror over and over, finding ways to describe the glass, the scar, the shelter, and the recovery without saying who caused it all. 3 days later, I delivered that speech at a women's conference and watched 800 people rise to their feet applauding while tears ran down my face. Jesse called the next morning with news that made my hands shake as he explained how he'd gotten Jackson's rehab records through a contact who worked at the facility. The records showed Jackson had checked in 3 times in the 2 years before the glass incident, each time for alcohol dependency, and each time he'd left against medical advice. The intake forms from his last visit 2 months before he threw the glass documented that he was drinking a fifth of vodka daily and had been written up at work for showing up drunk. Jesse emailed the documents to Melanie, who immediately filed them as evidence contradicting Jackson's claim that I'd driven him to drink or that he'd been sober before meeting me. The summary judgment hearing happened 2 weeks later in Judge Osborne's courtroom, where both legal teams argued for 3 hours about which claims should proceed to trial. Tyson Steele stood there in his expensive suit claiming I'd orchestrated a deliberate campaign to destroy an innocent man, while Melanie methodically dismantled each allegation with evidence. Judge Osborne took a week to issue his ruling dismissing the intentional infliction of emotional distress claim and 2 other counts as legally insufficient, but allowing the defamation claim to move forward. Melanie said it was actually a good result since it narrowed the case significantly, but I still felt sick knowing we'd have to go through a full trial. My sponsors responded to the ruling by launching a coordinated social media campaign about standing with survivors that carefully avoided mentioning my name or specific case details. Every major brand I worked with posted the same message at the same time about believing women and supporting those who speak their truth. The online harassment from Jackson's supporters got drowned out by millions of supportive comments from people sharing their own stories of survival. Sophie showed me analytics proving the campaign reached over 50 million people in the first 24 hours. The deposition started on a Monday morning in a sterile conference room where Tyson Steele spent 8 hours trying to break me down with questions designed to make me look crazy. He showed blown-up photos of my scar, asking if I'd ever had thoughts of self-harm before the incident, while I used Adriana's breathing techniques to stay calm. The second day was worse, with him reading old text messages out of context and asking why I stayed with Jackson if things were so bad. I stuck to simple, truthful answers even when he tried to twist my words, remembering Adriana's advice to pause, breathe, and respond, rather than react. By the time it ended Tuesday evening, I was exhausted, but Melanie said I'd done perfectly by not giving him any ammunition to use against us. Someone leaked edited clips of my deposition online within 48 hours, cutting my answers to make it seem like I was being evasive or contradicting myself. Kathy Sumner saw through the manipulation immediately and published the full transcript on her news site with annotations showing exactly what had been cut and why it mattered. The side-by-side comparison was so obvious that even neutral observers started calling out Jackson's team for their dirty tactics. Kathy kept digging and discovered the Men's Rights Network backing Jackson had funded 12 similar lawsuits against prominent women who'd spoken about abuse. Her investigation showed they specifically targeted women with public platforms, using the legal system to silence and bankrupt them. She published the exposé despite 3 cease and desist letters, though her editor made her redact some names to avoid additional lawsuits. The ER doctor who'd treated me finally agreed to help after his lawyer assured him that telling the truth in a legal proceeding couldn't result in liability. His written declaration detailed the glass fragments he'd removed from my face, the angle of impact proving the glass was thrown not self-inflicted, and his professional opinion that the injury pattern was consistent with assault. Melanie filed it as evidence along with his original medical notes and photos from that night. Jackson's team responded by filing complaints with the medical board claiming the doctor had violated HIPAA by discussing my case, and with the photography board saying the photographer had exploited a vulnerable person. Judge Osborne called both sides into court and warned Tyson Steele that continued harassment of witnesses would result in sanctions, including possible dismissal of the case. The next morning, Sophie called me with news that made me actually laugh for the first time in weeks. The audit Jackson's fake invoices had triggered came back showing our foundation didn't just meet industry standards but exceeded them by every measure. Our accountant had worked around the clock pulling 5 years of records, and the independent auditors found we spent 93 cents of every dollar directly on helping women escape abuse. Sophie posted the full audit report on our website and social media, with a simple message about transparency and truth always winning. Within hours, 3 new corporate sponsors reached out wanting to support an organization with such clean finances. Ricardo called Melanie that same afternoon saying he'd found his old performance reviews from Jackson's company. The documentation showed Jackson had been written up twice for showing up drunk to client meetings the month before he threw the glass at me. There was even an email from HR warning him that one more incident would mean termination. Ricardo faxed over 20 pages, including witness statements from co-workers who'd seen Jackson drinking vodka from a water bottle at his desk. Melanie added it all to our evidence file, which was now thick enough to need its own filing cabinet. The court-ordered mediation happened 2 weeks later in a bland conference room downtown. Jackson showed up in a suit that looked too big for him now and wouldn't make eye contact with me. Tyson Steele did all the talking while Jackson sat there with his arms crossed. They wanted $10 million plus a public apology where I'd admit to exaggerating the incident. The mediator, an older woman who'd seen everything, actually stopped taking notes and stared at Tyson. She told him the demand was completely unrealistic, given the mountain of evidence we'd presented. Jackson's face turned red and he slammed his hand on the table before Tyson grabbed his arm. We left after 2 hours with nothing resolved. I started my university speaking tour the next week, driving to 3 different campuses with Crystal as my security. My modified speech never mentioned Jackson by name, but talked about surviving trauma and rebuilding your life. At the first university, a young woman waited after everyone else left to tell me she'd finally called the police on her boyfriend after hearing my story online. At the second campus, 3 girls approached me together saying they'd started their own support group. The third university had overflow crowds, and security had to turn people away. Each time I spoke, I felt stronger, remembering why I'd started telling my story in the first place. With the trial date set for next month, I needed structure to keep from going crazy with anxiety. Crystal started picking me up at 6 every morning for runs through the park where we never talked about the case. Adriana scheduled evening phone calls where we worked through breathing exercises and visualization techniques. Every weekend, Melanie came to my apartment for strategy sessions, where we reviewed testimony and practiced staying calm under pressure. The routine made me feel like I had some control when everything else was chaos. Jenny called an emergency foundation board meeting where she surprised me by making a motion to legally separate my personal situation from the organization. The vote was unanimous, with every board member standing to show their support, even while protecting the foundation's future. We spent the next week restructuring everything so the organization could continue helping women no matter what happened at trial. Our lawyers created a trust structure that would protect our programs and the women we served. Melanie had an idea that would put everything out in the open before the trial started. We built a website called The Truth About That Night, where we posted every single document in chronological order: medical records, police reports, witness statements, Jackson's work reviews, the audit results, everything. Melanie's paralegal spent 3 days scanning and organizing hundreds of pages. We included a timeline showing exactly what happened with links to supporting evidence. The site went live on a Tuesday morning and crashed within an hour from too much traffic. Kathy Sumner tweeted the link and it went viral, with people actually reading through the evidence. Comments poured in from lawyers saying no reasonable jury could side with Jackson after seeing everything laid out so clearly. That night, I stood in my bathroom looking at my reflection in the mirror. My finger traced the curved scar that ran from my temple to the corner of my mouth, the crescent moon shape that had changed everything. Jackson wanted to destroy me for telling the truth, but I'd already won the only battle that mattered. I'd refused to be silenced. The woman in the mirror wasn't the scared victim who'd pressed a dish towel to her bleeding face. She was scarred but not broken, marked but not defeated. Tomorrow would bring more legal battles, and next month the trial would start. Jackson would keep trying to twist reality to make himself the victim. But tonight I could see the truth clearly. This scar had set me free. And that's the wrap-up for today. I always try to leave you with something that isn't just a story, but a little lesson you can carry with you. If this one sparked an idea or gave you something useful, that's a win in my book. Subscribe so you'll always have the next one ready when you need it.